Doug, you look great.
Thank you, Greg Olson.
You do. You are in the spirit.
I brought the spirit with me tonight. Doug Mitchell here from the Glacier Conservancy, where I have the privilege of working with the best team in the business year-round. Santa's workshop becomes our own workshop here around this time of year. Is we are so blessed by people like you who make year-end contributions to help us meet the goal of supporting Glacier National Park, this place we all hold so dear. So we've got a lot of people joining us tonight from all over the country again, as usual. I see Ed Wilson from the East Coast and Janet Brandt always holding us down in the heartland of America. Thanks for being in with us tonight. I am really delighted to be able to have George Bristol join us. George is a founding board member of the Glacier Fund 21 years ago. A group of people, including George, got together and said, we really need to do something to help in private philanthropy play a role in the protection of Glacier National Park. And without George and that visionary group, we would not be where we are today. If that alone were an accomplishment, George would merit a statue of his own. But I think if you look up Renaissance man in the dictionary, or these days I think Wikipedia is the new dictionary, there may very well be a picture of George Bristol. George has made an impact in so many places and so many issues in this world, from a young man to just recently, at the spry age of what I guess you would have been 78 at the time, passed a landmark ballot measure in Texas that provided for a permanent stream of constitutionally protected funding for Texas state parks. There is no quit in this guy, George Bristol. George, thanks so much for sharing an evening with us.
I'm glad to be here, Doug.
Well, we talked a little bit earlier about kind of spending a minute or two together, kind of putting the book in context. Take us back to 1961. Young George Bristol is on the train. The West Glacier Depot's not open. You got to go to Whitefish.
If I may, let me start off with a Life magazine picture. It'll be rushed, but it is the first color photo of a national park by Life magazine in August the 5th of 1940, just a week before I was born.
Wow.
And from that, I wrote a poem which pretty well set things in place, and I'd like to read it. In all likelihood, my mother read the August 5th, 1940 Life magazine. How else on steaming evenings with me not a week away could she catch Corporal Hitler and the cancerous Mussolini as they moved from Paris across Libya? All was far removed, nothing undone yet she, perhaps I, sensed the tension of the Emerson oscillators brushing over photos of the dictators who, like the Kelvinator ad, were poised to change our lives. The upcoming radio reached out through the antenna, gathering scratchings from skies blackened by autumn's unmentionable odor, lingering on the rim of gin glasses and the lips of Lucky Strike smokers. The world was brewing anew. Men, material, entire countries, soon wrapped in winter blankets, jungle rot, the inhuman stench of gasoline leaking from reeking meadows. My small world would know none of this, even as a cry went up down the block and neighborhood women hurried their own children inside before they ran to comfort those who had lost theirs. Yet 55 years after all that trails behind my own history, spotted with later conflicts, as I thumbed the near yellow pages, color photos of Glacier National Park's peaks, to confirm that somehow my mother began to steer me toward those safe mountains, even as the dread of war ran through the darkness of her womb. that kind of sums up how I got to the summer of 1961, where I took the Rock Island line to Minneapolis and then the Great Northern Railroad. Not to Belton Station, it wasn't open yet,
Right.
but on into Whitefish, Montana. And a nice couple from Libby, Montana drove me back to West Glacier. Actually, they drove me back to Frida's Bar and Grill, which was appropriate for somebody that hadn't had a beer since he'd left the University of Texas about a month ago. And I went inside and found my two best friends still, Doug Medley from Mississippi and Bruce Murphy from Colorado. And we've remained friends all these years. I could write a book of just what we did, but the statute of limitation hadn't run, and it's been 60 years. But we had a wonderful summer, and I came back one more summer. If I hadn't gone to Washington, D.C., I probably would have come back and become a permanent ranger, or at least tried to become a ranger. But it was a marvelous setting for a kid to step off a train and see all those mountains and pine trees, waterfalls, etc. And I never got over it. And my friend Dayton Duncan, who wrote the National Parks, America's Best Idea,
Right.
put it in terms. He said, I said I've never seen anything as beautiful, and I still do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, and you did such a great job in this book of not only telling the story of the giants who built the park system and specifically Glacier Park, but really in capturing the feeling of it, right? That one of my favorite chapters, and I asked this of the book club members, and it'll be interesting to hear some discussion about it here. The main thing is the whole thing. I think that was really kind of a revelation for me, because people ask me all the time, so what's so special about Glacier? And it really, George, it really is the whole thing is what's special about Glacier, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And furthermore, and I began to think about this even when I was on the trail crew, because we normally worked out of Mini Glacier and went up into the high country and the Belly River, etc. Glacier could be 4 or 5 different national parks in and of themselves. Some on the east side, some on the west side, some in Waterton, etc., etc. But the main thing is the whole thing. And as I said in the book, even if the whole thing for you is just driving on the Going to the Sun Highway and look at it, that becomes what you have known about Glacier, and it becomes the whole thing. On the other hand, if you've got, and I recommend let that be your scouting mission and come back again and begin to sense the different parts of the park and enjoy each of them for what they are. And there's so many things to enjoy that I never get tired of going.
Well, we never get tired of having you either. And we've had a little. We were hoping to see you this year, but that didn't work out. But next year's a whole new time for us, and we hope that you'll be able to get back up, because that'll. I mean, it's amazing that'll be how many years pretty much in a row for you, George?
60 years.
Wow.
During between 1961 and today, it's 60 years. I missed some years. I went to Washington twice. Had business, didn't go every year, but most every year I try to go at least one time. And
George and I also share a fun fact that both of us worked for United States senators who ended up being the chairman of the United States Senate Finance Committee, George with Lloyd Benson, and myself with our own Senator Baucus. And really, I mean it when I say Renaissance man, George. There's not a lot you can surprise George with. There's not a lot of people he doesn't know, as you can evidence from the fact that he has Laura Bush on the back of his book jacket. And so it's just such a treat to have you with us tonight, George. Folks, feel free to use the chat feature to ask questions. We've asked George if he'd be open to signing book plates, and he would be delighted to do that. So please just let Emily know if you'd like a book plate signed and how you'd like it signed, and we'll get the book plates to George so that he can wear out his signing hand and get those back to us, and we'll get them back out to you quickly. So George, I want to ask a little bit about, you added the Roosevelt section, or pieces of the Roosevelt section, to the newer edition. Talk to us a little about that.
Well, first of all, I'm a big devotee of Franklin D. Roosevelt, and particularly what he did with the CCC. That always struck me. And really, the trail crew, which I worked on for 2 years, is the last remnant of the CCC. Given that, with plus my political life, and I did some advanced man chores over the years for Hubert Humphrey and Lloyd Benson and others. And it's interesting to read the planning papers that are in that section. And then Franklin Roosevelt's obvious joy at being at Glacier and being with the CCC. He was very proud of it. He came to it very early in life by trying to reforest his father's and mother's estate. And that led him to some preliminary programs when he was governor of New York. And then when he got to Washington, one of the very first things he did was to send a memo that he wanted the CCC that could have up to 500,000 men by the end of the summer. And they got, I think, to 300,000. But over the course from 1933 to 1942, 3 million young people got to work out in the parks and along roads, and first one thing and another. But a lot of work was done on national parks and state parks. And so I just thought all the planning that had to go in to a presidential trip, and then just think how complicated it got with a man who was crippled.
Right.
So there were a lot of things. One of the side stories there was the Black Chorus Group. There was a CCC encampment for Black young men way up the North Fork River past Pole Bridge. But they would come down and play baseball and stuff, and they had a wonderful singing group that sang on the local radio. And they were brought to this ceremony and sang for the president. And he very much enjoyed hearing them. And then the Blackfoot tribesmen went back to the reservation. The white participants went home, and the Black CCC workers went back up the North Fork. And I never could find any mention of them again, but that must have been a high watermark for their lives to sing to the President of the United States.
Yeah, that's super interesting. We read and talk a lot about the Greatest Generation, and it feels to me like CCC, George, was a part of that, as it all revolved, to me at least, I'd be interested in your view, about service, right? That was in the 30s, 40s, that was really a big thing for America and for Americans. Do you think we've lost that a little bit, or how do you look at that as somebody who may have a better perspective than I?
Well, I think a lot of the people who went through the Depression, whether they worked in the CCC or what, then turned right around and went to war. The Lloyd Bensons, the Bob Doles, on and on and on. When they got to Washington at about the same time, they knew each other had fought for their country. They knew that each of them had gone through a terrible depression together, and they respected each other, and they admired each other. This is George Bristol talking, but I think Lloyd Benson and Bob Dole, his ranking Republican member, could have hammered out a COVID tax package in about 2 or 3 days. And they did it with grace and respect for each other. They disagreed, but they'd work it out, and they didn't go around lying and calling each other names. And it's what we have going on today. I think it's a disgrace.
Well, it's you know, it is interesting to think back about this whole idea. You know, we had I was able to listen to one of the CCC, well, today's CCC members, AmeriCorps members, talking about her kind of coming of age moment that, you know, a 16-pound rock and a Pulaski taught her a lot about perseverance and patience. Right. And I think there really is something to that. And that, you know, getting your hands dirty, whether it's in the CCC or whether it's, being one of the many women who worked in Oakland, California, putting nuts and bolts into men and women, putting nuts and bolts into, you know, the 75 ships that got shipped out of there every day. There's something about service that always, has been important, I know, to you and to me, and really is what we're about at the Conservancy. But we go on all night about that. I want to get into the book a little bit. We've got a bunch of our board members who have been kind enough to join us. Margaret Notley and Kathy Stein and Greg Olson, Lana Batts and John Donovan. I see you're all on. Thank you for joining us. But part of the reason why is we've been kibitzing about one of the major issues, George, that you talk about in the book and that I asked readers to weigh in on. And please use the chat feature if you want, or just, go, feel free to unmute yourself and talk straight ahead. But, you talk about this delicate balance, if you will, in the Organic Act that in one simple sentence tells us to do two very different things. Let everyone enjoy the park and keep it exactly this way it is. So how do we do that, George? We're taking notes.
Well, give you a little more of the history. Frederick Law Olmsted wrote a wonderful treatise called Report on the Yosemite. That was the original pronunciation of Yosemite. Report, 1865. It's a marvelous Declaration of Independence and Constitution, all wrapped up in one for the national parks. But in there, he mentioned this delicate balance between preservation and conservation. Preservation is exactly what it says it is, to preserve that which is there. And conservation, it has a broader term in that it's for the best and mightiest use, i.e. the recreational aspect. From time to time, we swing one way, like everything in politics, and then we swing back the other. But for the most part, Doug, the National Park Service has done a marvelous job of making the balance work, even with the fact that 2-3 million last year. How many people went through the park?
It's going to be just 2 million, probably somewhere in that neighborhood.
2 million. When I worked there, 300,000 was the top number. But most of Glacier National Park is wilderness. It's not defined by law, as I understand it. Montana's being one or two states that hasn't done that. But most of what you see is wilderness area. And within that, you have all the flora and fauna blossoming and growing in profusion. You have to have a road, and even the road itself, under Stephen Mather's dictate, must have had a minimum of switchbacks and have been easy on the eye, was a term that Mather used. And that's a conservation preservation action in and of itself.
Mhm.
I, for one, think the tension helps, because people who work for the national parks are devoted to the entire two sentences, not just one part of it. And they, if long as they have that tension there, as long as one side doesn't outweigh the other one too much, you can make adjustments and back and forth until you basically get it kind of right. There's going to be some slip ups. There's going to have to be some more campground sometime. But for the most part, the National Park Service does a wonderful job. And for the most part, most of the time, there's always some damn fools and some flower wreckers that get off the trail and stuff. But for the most part, people there that come as visitors, they sense it's their parks, and so they take care of it. They do a pretty good job of taking care of it.
We asked this question to our book clubbers, and I got a good response earlier today from Carl and Candy, who really thoughtfully kind of said that this is becoming a challenge due to the increase in visitors, and that maybe thinking about increasing or making a more functional shuttle system from the visitor center, Apgar to Logan, and thinking about traffic management. And I know we've been thinking about that as a board. That probably, was something you guys were dealing with way back when as well, too, George.
Not really. First of all, we pretty well stayed in the mini glacier area, which is off the beaten path, and we stayed up in the mountains at camps, even when we were there. But I can remember driving long stretches going to the Sun Highway and not seeing a single car. You can't go at any time. My family and I have gotten up earlier and earlier and earlier to try to get to Logan Pass to park the car. And I think next time we do it, we'll just pull it in there one day and leave it till we come back for a week or two.
Yeah, it does create some strange results. Well, Jill, I see we're getting some great questions in the chat, and I'll kind of hand it over to you to curate some of those. I see Ed Wilson is in there already, and Noel and Carl and Candy. So I'll turn that over to you.
Yeah, I'll just work down the list here, George. Ed mentioned he was surprised to see that Mike Mansfield supported the Glacier View Dam project. So he's wondering, how do you account for that?
Well, first of all, he was the senior senator. He wanted it. I don't know who convinced him but he pushed it. He pushed it hard. He lost in the end because of people that were concerned from the other side. But he always put a bill in the hopper to reestablish it. It never came to be, but the road to Pole Bridge and such was supposed to go all the way out to Canada, and it was going to be a separate side of the park. It was going to be one of those other parks I talked about, but they never got around. And I don't know. I haven't been to where the dam was supposed to be, so I can't really judge whether it should have been. I do think that road should have been built to take the pressure off, because a lot of people can go to Canada that way just as easy as they can going to the Sun Pass and around through Babb and back in to Waterton that way. But I doubt it, and given the budget situations we've had lately, I doubt that we'll ever make it at least not in my lifetime. And maybe it shouldn't be, but after studying and reading about it, I came to the conclusion that it probably would have been a good idea to do it, particularly since we're faced with 2-3 million people.
Sure.
Yeah.
And
I think this is a great question, Ed. George, you might have to write another book. You might have to get to researching this because as you know, the Northwest Montana was a big energy consuming industry, right? We had the timber industry with Plum Creek and all the timber companies. And then of course, Asarco, the aluminum company, which is all about power. And you wonder whether that combined with Montana Power had some impact on Senator Mansfield. It's a really great question, really interesting subject, and really neat that you brought it up in the book.
All right. There's a couple questions. This could be a really easy question for you, George, or a really hard question since you have so many years of visiting Glacier and experiences in Glacier. So Noelle asked, where is your favorite place in Glacier and what is your favorite memory?
my favorite place in Glacier is where I happened to be standing at the time. And memories, my Lord, I've written a book about it. I've written 2 books about it. I wrote another book called On Politics in Parks, which is autobiographical, but a lot of it has to do with Glacier. Mini Glacier is the core of the heart of my soul. I worked there, I went back. I know it. I know almost every trail by heart. I know some trails that don't even exist anymore. But I can stand out on the porch of the Mini Glacier Hotel and just watch the sun and the clouds and everything move. And I find great peace in that.
Yeah. Carl and Candy are wondering if you've had any encounters with grizzlies that stand out to you.
Well, I'm so glad somebody finally asked that. Before I came to Glacier in 1961, I had taught myself, and going all the way back, I guess, to my Weatherford, Texas days, how to make a perfect slingshot out of surgical tubing and a hand-carved handle. And I brought it with me to Glacier Park. And we went to orientation, and they told us about the bears and to be on lookout for them and talk loud, et cetera, and take bells, which have since been jettisoned. But my job on the trail going up and coming back down the trails was to watch for grizzly bears, and if they came, to shoot them with my slingshot. Fortunately, I only saw a grizzly bear on the trail at one time, and I got ready to shoot it, but it went on down the trail and left us alone. But we were always prepared to see bear, and we saw them from a distance, much more than you do today. They still, when I was there, they still went to the garbage area of the Mini Glacier Hotel. And of course, that was all quit and jettisoned by the terrible incidents in 1967 with the Night of the Grizzlies. So there, we probably, when we worked in the Mini Glacier area where we could have great views, we saw them every week. Not so much in the further back country, but in the Mini Glacier area, and you still can see a lot of grizzlies there.
Yeah.
I see that Marianne Myers has voted with you, George, about Mini Glacier being a special place for her. I also asked in the pre-questions, and I'd be interested to have people just weigh in, just unmute yourself and say so, or just put it in the chat. about this the main thing is the whole thing. What is one of your main places? Like for Julie and I, our kind of anniversary hike, which we take adjacent to our anniversary every year, is Dawson Pitamakan. And just to be up there, particularly in between the two on that backside, is really something for us that the whole thing is the main thing. But if I had to choose one day to do, if I had one day to do it over again, that'd probably be where you'd find me.
Right.
I'd say Belly River.
Belly River? That's a very special spot as well, Bruce.
Yeah, I spent 3 summers in there as foreman on trail.
Oh, nice.
Hey, Bruce.
Hey, George, thanks for the shout out.
Yeah.
Good
So
to
do you
hear.
ever have to fix any of George's work?
Well, I'm not sure that there's enough time today to get into stories that I could tell you about George. So
Remember that the statute has not run on you too.
Yeah. It's just you and me, Bruce. You just cut loose. Nobody else can hear you.
no, some other moment we'll tell some
There you go.
stories.
Where are you joining us from, Bruce?
I live outside of Montreal.
Oh, excellent. Wow. Welcome aboard.
We try at least every 3 years to get together. Sometimes we make it more than that, but it's amazing to me, 60 years coming up, and we've stuck together through thick and thin, really.
So there's another, I just flipped through my screen and I see another trail crew veteran sitting in his living room in front of my painting in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And that would be my dear friend Bing and Mary. We're in the park together all those many years ago as well. Bing, did you ever run into to George here?
I was not so privileged to have run into him, but I was in the park, and Mary was at Many Glacier in 1960. The year before George got up there, and I spent most of my time in Two Medicine. And George is right. You kind of get attached to the place where you initially had exposure to Glacier.
Yeah,
George,
no.
I did have a question though. In your book, which is a fascinating story about how Glacier Park had come together, it seemed to me that the hills and Great Northern were the commercial interest, and that there was a governmental interest in developing parks and getting people there. So it was a very cooperative type of thing. I don't see that happening in government today. Is there a possibility that it will happen in the future? And if so, how?
Well, first of all, parks should take some time to be developed for the Congress to accept them, to make sure it's the right deal. But for instance, the new park up in Maine that our friend Roxy Quimby put together, she finally had to back away and ask President Obama to make it a national monument. And that is under the Antiquities Act, which I think is one of the 2 most important and necessary pieces of legislation for national parks, because it allows our presidents to make monuments, which is almost enough protection, not quite the same as a national park, until the Congress can come to the census. But it's not just the present Congress. Since the beginning of time of national parks, it's always been a struggle to get Congress, and then they get some nature-loving people in the Senate, and they get it passed, and they create 4 or 5, and then they draw up again, and maybe another 10 years before they get it. So yes, I think there'll be other national parks, but I do subscribe to Stephen Mather's rule of make them the most supreme and most awesome of all the scenic areas to see. You know, we've had some damn fool gifts almost given to us over the years. Thank God they turned them down because some of them were just boondoggles.
Well, Jill, looks like we're getting some more questions. I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, and if anyone else wants to leave your comments in the chat about your favorite place in Glacier, that's fun to look through those. There were a couple other many Glacier favorites for some. Marilyn mentioned her parents met in many while they were both working there back in the 40s. And they went back there often to visit while she was growing up. So her heart remains there. So I thought that was really cool. Let's see. Nicholas had a similar question to what you were just talking about, George. He asked, at the end of the book, you talk about your hopes and the power of the NPS Centennial as a step forward for conservation efforts in America. So he's wondering, did the Centennial live up to your hopes?
Well, it's an ongoing thing. First of all, financially, the National Park Foundation raised over $500 million, which is when I went on the board in 1964, 65. I think we raised about $1 million. So the private funding is good. And by the way, I'm a big proponent in private philanthropy. Almost all of our national parks, going all the way back to Yellowstone and Yosemite and Glacier, were recipients of private funding, and certainly no more so than what the Rockefellers over the years have done through both John D. Jr. and Lawrence Rockefeller. But as to the thought that there should be other parks, et cetera, of course there should be. Big Bend is a perfect example. It was brought to fruition on June the 6th, 1944. I only say that because it happened to be D-Day at Normandy. And yet the work of the national park, Lincoln created a national park, or actually created a state park, which became a national park with Yosemite, by passing a bill to allow that transference to take place. Almost in every great conflict we've had in this country, parks have remained on people's agenda. So they'll come again. It sometimes takes a while, but you got to remember, Grinnell and Louis Hill fought for Glacier Park for about 10, 15 years. And they almost lost it in March of 2010, when the House of Representatives went into revolt, and 149 Democrats and about 48 revolting Republicans stripped Speaker Joe Cannon of his power because he was a dictator. The reason they could do that, and the reason they had enough votes to do it, is that at that particular time, most Republican House members were Irish. And they all went across the street for a couple of days to drink and sing Irish tunes together, and they couldn't round them back up. And so the Irish take credit for Glacier Park. The revolutionaries and the remaining in Congress passed the bill, and it was signed into law in May of 1910. Great story. Great story.
Really great story.
Kind of an ethnic slur on us Irish, but
Well, I'm a Donahoe. There he is, folks.
Doug, this is Marshall Gingrey. I have a couple of questions for George.
Yeah, hey, Marshall.
Well, first of all, for the rest of the audience, you're talking about my home. And time George got there in '61, I was a ranger there. But George, I'm not too sure that a good writer such as yourself shouldn't do something on the building of the trails and certainly the personalities. I was the trail foreman for the summer, mostly for the west side, but east side as well. And a lot of these young men at that time, a lot of them got their job through secretary appointments, and they were from families that you would know in your state, senators' sons and grandsons. But a lot of them went on to do interesting things in their life, but the trail crew was an interesting crew. We had about 50 young, usually fairly young people in college age, and some of us were a little bit younger. If you don't know it, being a son of an employee in the park, you could go to work on trails and blister rust and all that kind of stuff at age 15. So anyway, what I want to ask George, my first question is, George, have you thought about writing a little bit more about the personalities? I just read your book twice here, and you did a great job, I thought, on the glacier age and also the geology. But I think that this day and age, people would be interested in some of the personalities. You know, you could start with Ed Hummel. You mentioned him, and he was a neighbor. He was the superintendent there. But there's a lot of other personalities, and the administrative history that the parks have to keep up are usually pretty dull. But I think there's a lot of personalities that the public would be quite interested in, some of the in-holding personalities as well, and the different aspects and how the Park Service and so that's my first question, if you'd like to expound on that. The other thing is that we've came a long ways, and you're right, George, and all of us know that the national parks were pretty much in the West were pushed by the railroad companies, all your big ones, for tourism and this kind of thing. But the preservation is very difficult as managing national parks across the country from Acadia to Blue Ridge, others. My real question there, George, is that I think a lot of people would be interested in how those laws, I served 5 or 6 administrations, and you were in Washington as well, how some of those laws came about and what effect did they have on our parks and the preservation, but still have the happiness to visit a park and all our different 400 parks. So I don't want to linger too much here, but could you kind of talk about personalities or think about that? And the other thing is, how did all these laws impact us in managing the national parks?
Well, on the first question, I gave it a lot of thought. I looked at the fact that Clark Gable came to Glacier Park, and Will Rogers came to Glacier Park, and John Malkovich was on the trail crew and this and that. But when you're putting a book, and I had certain guidelines to follow, page numbers being one of them, you have to make choices. Would I be interested in writing about the trail crew? Sure, I would. I mean, but there are others can do just as good a job, and I'm in the process of writing a history of the state parks for its centennial in 2023. So I've got to concentrate on that. As to the second one, you have to be ever vigilant, and there are groups like the National Park and Conservation Association that watch legislation to make sure that no damn fool stuff gets put in there. Sometimes it does anyway, and you get steamrolled. But for the most part, one of the interesting things that came out this last year, the Great American Outdoors Act, which includes the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is little known, but it's a major funding of local parks and national parks and wildlife management areas through a Lyndon Johnson bill, which was one of the first ones he passed in 1964. Billions of dollars have flowed out, and it's been renewed now, and it's akin. There's some differences, but it's akin to the bill that we got passed and the amendment we got passed in Texas. It makes it permanent forever. Now, will a future Congress try to raid it? Oh, of course they will. So you got to have your watchdog groups to, and as I say, the National Park and Conservation Association and the Wilderness Society, et cetera, they do a good job of keeping people informed. And I don't know how many times a year, but 5 or 6 times a year, I write my congressman or call them up or whatever to either be for or against.
We've got about 15 minutes with George. Got some great questions yet to go. Again, thanks to everybody for joining us tonight. Our 2021 book club offerings are already available, and I actually have a full slate for next year. So stay tuned on that. The first one is January 16th with Paul Bogart, The End of Night. Anybody interested in the dark skies movement will really love this book. Paul's a terrific writer, and he calls it a memoir, but it really is kind of a great overview of kind of lighting and nighttime lighting in parks and in cities. It's really a lovely book. So it's January. Also, thanks again to our board for joining us tonight. They actually, and many of you may have seen the emails, they have ponied up $75,000 for these last three weeks of the year to match 3-to-1 donor contributions through the last end of the year. So thanks very much for that. And I know a lot of people think about doing their contributions at the end of the year, and we appreciate your support of Glacier National Park. So Jill, I don't want to say any more than that because I know we've got still some questions to get to.
Yeah. George, you kind of just covered this. You mentioned you were writing about the history of the state parks. That was actually one of our questions earlier. Someone was wondering if you're working on any other book projects at the moment. So is that the main work you're pursuing right now?
It is the all-consuming. And in a very sad way, I'm one of the beneficiaries of the pandemic because we're more or less totally in lockdown, quarantined, if you will, my wife and I. We don't go out any much anymore. We don't have a lot of appointments, but we don't have phone calls and other things. So for the last 9 months, all I've had to do is write and take a break in September and go to Montana. But I always consider that's part of what I'm writing about anyway. Somebody once said I have to stick my arms up to my elbows in Lake McDonald once a year to get a recharge of my batteries. So that, to get back to what Marshall was talking about, what I like to, I got 100 things I'd like to write about, but this is a big one. And then when we get to it, that we'll take a look and see how health and age hammers things out.
Very cool. George, do you have any advice? This is a question from Leah. She's wondering if you could advise, if you have any piece of advice on getting people, particularly younger people, interested in the safekeeping of our parks, maybe even if they aren't able to visit them.
Well, there are some programs. There's the, Jennifer, what's the one park?
The Children in Nature
Ch-
Network.
Children in Nature Network, which is Richard Louv really began to bring to the forefront. They're sort of the new trail crew, public works crew, and that's what's Parks?
Well, Parks Month is in Texas with the Conservation Corps.
Yeah, the Conservation Corps. So there are some groups that work. There's not as many, and I'd like to see not only see America first, but take care of America first. And so, can more be done, and should it be done in the schools and stuff? Yes, but it's going to take time and money to put it together.
Mhm.
And it
Sure.
always does. Money's the barrier that's built all around everything. It's also how you get things done. And I'd rather have $2 million coming in every year than 100,000 like we did the first couple of years of the Glacier Fund.
Myrna had a great question. She actually was involved in writing the computer model that predicted when the glaciers would be gone. So, and we have this great repeat photography out there that shows how the glaciers have shrunk, particularly in this last century. So she was wondering, have you personally taken pictures over time that you've noticed have illustrated a changing landscape or shrinking glaciers or any changes in vegetation in glacier?
Interestingly enough, I've got several photos over the years taken from the many glacier balconies of Grinnell Glacier. And when I first went there in 61 and 62, and Bruce can bear this out, you know, we were dynamiting and fixing the trails, and you could see them from the hotel. Now you have to walk up over the hill and down into it, and it's slush and everything else. When I first came to Glacier in 1961, I think there were 80 recognizable glaciers. Today, I think there are 25, and about half of them are on life support. So they're gonna be gone pretty soon. One of my biggest concerns, which I learned from research on this book, is not just that the glaciers carve these magnificent mountains, but they are also were and are the cooling towers for, along with the Himalayas and others, of the world. And in my book, I quote Christopher White, who said, when ice and climate are in equilibrium, civilization carries on. When we lose the cooling towers and the watering towers, think how much of the Great Plains water supplies and temperature ranges are going to be affected. It's not just going to be Glacier Park, but it's going to be all the lands and ecosystems that Glacier Park waters and cools, and has for 2, 3, 4, 5 centuries. We finally got it just right after about a billion and a half years. And it's taken us about 300 years to really screw it up.
Let's see.
I think we did a pretty good job, Jill, getting through questions and
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out if I missed any. If I did skim over yours, just feel free to shoot me a chat or unmute yourself. There's several comments too of just people sharing their favorite places in Glacier or just really neat memories, or maybe
I was gonna add too to Leah's good question. You know, the one of the things that we've been able to help with this year is kind of helping the park pivot from, bringing students to the park, and instead of bringing the park to students. So thinking through distance learning, both in terms of ranger interactions and Native America Speaks programming, et cetera. My wife, who teaches at Helena High, started a program called Glacier College. And this week she has been having a number of researchers in the park and rangers in the park visit with her students, kind of to that end, to see if we can, it's really a big thing for the Conservancy to train the next generation of stewards, right? We're all not going to be around forever. And so that's really an important thing. The education focus of the Conservancy, and Greg Olson is helping work on a real focused project about how we work through that as the Conservancy and continue to support those impactful programs, both in the park and to use this opportunity for learning outside the park. Well, George, Bristol, we really appreciate your time tonight. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I always keep these pretty much exactly to an hour. So, George, I want to just thank you so much for all that you've done for us. Again, a founding member of the Glacier Fund then board, which we celebrated the 20th anniversary of last year with a bunch of good friends getting together at Grouse Mountain Lodge. And if folks want a book plate from George, thanks too for agreeing to do that. Please spend his last couple of minutes putting that request in. George, we really wish you the best of luck on the Texas book. Are you getting pretty close?
I'm almost through with the first rough draft, and then we'll start filling in the cracks and getting bibliographies. The hard part comes now. Writing is easy. Bibliographies and such are just hell. That's all I can say.
Yeah, that's where I think maybe you just turn it into a novel, and then you just don't have to worry about any of that.
That's right. That's right. But listen, I always like to get together and talk about Glacier Park. I was thinking about it this past weekend. I called our friend Doug Medley to see where he was. And Bruce, we need to do another Zoom before Christmas.
That's a good idea. Yeah, where's Doug now? Is he in Mississippi or in?
He's in Mississippi. Excuse us all. We got a little trail crew business.
Right, little trail crew business. I like it.
I deeply appreciate this.
I like it.
I'm appreciative you like the book, and I hope it adds to the body politic.
Well, we've been able to spend the evening with a legend, and I still say that lightly, having been around a lot of people in my life, and the more I know about George Bristol, the more I just feel privileged, George, to call you my friend, to call you our friend, and to have had you make such a big impact on our organization and on this place that we all hold so dear. So
my daddy would have been proud, and my mother would have believed you.
Perfect. And with that, everyone have a great evening. Thanks so much. Good night.
Thank you, George.
Thanks, George.
Thanks, everyone. Good seeing you all.
Thanks, George. Thanks, Doug.
Bye, George.
Bye-bye.